Okay, the recording has begun.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Welcome to the auditor training for the tin and tantalum protocol, procedures and audit tools that have been revised for the conflict-free Smelter program, effective 1st of February 2014. This program will look at the renewed or revised methodology as it is now defined in the audit protocol and procedure for tin and tantalum. It will also look at the determination of applicability for the origin determination of raw materials purchased. The training will then look at the different compliance requirements as they are defined now for tin and tantalum. And finally, it will provide an overview on the audit tools, which includes the pre-audit checklist, a revised audit checklist and line item summary document, as well as a summary audit report. At the end of this training, participants that have listened to this session should be familiar with the revised audit protocol and procedures for tin and tantalum. They should be able to apply the new audit tools for those two minerals. Participants are expected to understand the conflict-free Smelter program's expectations for sourcing from level 3 high-risk countries, as well as be aware of additional resources that can provide further information on the conflict-free smelter initiative, on the minerals that are tin and tantalum, the OECD due diligence guidance, as well as level 3 in-region sourcing mechanisms. With that, we're going to look into some of the changes to the audit methodology. Overall, it needs to be noted that there is an increased focus on a management systems evaluation in order to ensure consistency with the ISO 19011 standard. This means that auditors are less required to look at individual purchases or individual calculations of the smelter, and they are more encouraged to evaluate management systems in place at the smelter and to test those systems by looking at different purchases placed or different actions taken to control inventory by the smelter. This shift of the focus on management systems means that there is an expanded section on conflict minerals policy compliance, which further defines requirements there. It also means that some of the previous audit exercises, such as the internal law traceability exercise, have been removed, as well as the revision of the shipping records or sales receipts, as it was previously referred to, as well as the full physical inventory check have been reduced now. Both of these exercises are now only there for the purpose of testing management systems to record output as well as to manage inventory, but there is no requirement anymore to test those for 100% compatibility with records available. Lastly, because of the management systems approach, low-risk purchases, mainly those from a level 1 country and secondary using a sampling approach so as to reduce the amount of time auditors have to spend at the smelter. The two main documents auditors should refer to if they need further information on the assessment are the audit protocol and the audit procedure. It is highly recommended that auditors read both these documents in detail before going on site to do a smelter audit under the CFSP. The audit protocol is equivalent to a standard or code of conduct for a comparable audit, as it defines the audit requirements. It is divided into the sections for the three main audit requirements, which include the conflict minerals policy, mass balance requirements, as well as compliance requirements for the material type and origin determination. The audit protocol is further useful for auditors to define the audit scope. It includes the definition of what a smelter under the CFS program should be. Most of the times this determination should have been made prior to the auditor arriving on site. However, if there are any concerns or observations in that the processes at the smelter do not seem to conform to the definition, auditors should refer to the audit protocol to make sure that the smelter is actually does actually fall under the definition of the CFSP. The audit protocol also defines which type of material is included in the scope of the audit, and it outlines the different timings for an initial audit as well as for any follow-up audits or re-audits on an annual basis. Lastly, the protocol provides guidance for the determination of applicability of the origin demonstration. This section will be treated in more detail in the coming slides. The audit procedure, on the other hand side, can be compared to a manual or guidance document. It outlines primarily how the audit is supposed to take place and provides guidance which is structured in accordance with the audit flow. And as such, it is divided into three phases: the pre-audit phase, the on-site audit phase, and the post-audit follow-up. Auditors can refer to any of these sections to learn more about the methodologies and the different steps to be undertaken to prepare and conduct an audit, as well as the follow-up actions should there any non-compliances be identified. The audit procedure also defines the pre-audit responsibilities for the conflict-free smelter program manager, the smelter itself, as well as the auditor. This is particularly important in that there is quite a number of exercises to be completed before the on-site visit of the auditor, and this section aims to assist all participants in making sure everybody is clear on the roles and responsibilities of each party. The audit procedure also provides guidance on the corrective action management. The determination of applicability section in the audit protocol, as well as the procedure, refers to different steps the auditors are expected to undertake to define whether or not the entire documentation of origin and transportation is required for a given purchase of tin or tantalum material. As is listed on this slide, there is a number of categories of material that have reduced expectations in regards of the documentation that needs to be provided. The first type of material includes so-called legacy materials, which are covered in more detail in Annex A. Legacy materials are those materials which were outside the supply chain prior to January 31st, 2013. For these materials, it is expected that auditors would be able to confirm the production date being actually before January 31st, 2013, as well as review limited transportation documentation. However, no full origin determination is required for this type of material. The other category covered in Annex B of the audit protocol is the secondary material, which, as is listed here in the definition, concerns reclaimed end-user or post-consumer products or scrap process materials that were created during the product manufacturing process. This definition originates in the OECD due diligence guidance, and the audit protocol includes extensive lists of examples of material that would fall under this definition. Auditors are primarily expected to validate that what the smelter has claimed to be secondary material is indeed secondary, and as such there is a very limited expectation on documentation that needs to be available. Another category where no documentation of origin needs to be provided are assays and samples. These are very small quantities of materials from level 1 or level 2 countries, provided that the aggregate amount received by the smelter over the audit period is less than 0.3% of the total receipts. So again, this concerns only very small quantities that are used for sampling or assaying. Annex D in the audit protocol further describes various arrangements that have been made for low-risk sources, such as conflict-free smelter compliant smelters that supply material to the smelter that is being audited, metal warehouses or exchanges, although the expectation for documentation from those will depend on whether the material sourced from a warehouse or a metal exchange has originated from a compliant, CFS compliant smelter or not, as well as the level 1 purchases, which, as has been mentioned before, now require only a sample to be reviewed by the auditor. Again, auditors are encouraged and should look at Annex D of the audit protocol to make sure that they fully understand the documentation requirements for each of those categories. There have also been a few scenarios where transitional arrangements have been made. This is only applicable for tin smelters and only for a limited period of time until the tin smelters start to have more approved suppliers at their disposition for the sourcing of conflict-free material. So the auditor will need to look at the Annex D of the audit protocol, as well as in some cases to contact the conflict-free smelter program manager to make sure that the list of documents that is required here is available during the on-site audit. Lastly, there are artisanal and small-scale mining sources, which are covered in Annex E of the audit protocol. This is material that has been produced by such artisanal or small-scale mining operations, and recognizing that there is limited documentation available, there are reduced expectations for the documents that need to be provided for review. In both the audit protocol and the audit procedure, you will find this flowchart that lists the different steps to determine whether the material needs a full origin, country of origin determination. Going through this flowchart should enable you to cover all those different categories as they were mentioned in the previous slide, and in the end determine whether there is any reduced expectation for documentation for the material at hand, or whether the smelter will need to provide the entire documentation of origin and transportation in accordance with the risk level of the country of origin. We are now going to look at the compliance requirements in order to see if there have been any changes from the previous audit protocol. Conflict minerals policy compliance requirements have remained largely the same. There has been a little bit of an extension in what needs to be covered in the policy. However, the key points here are still the same in that a conflict minerals policy must be documented, effective, and communicated to suppliers as well as internally. It must cover a certain number of points, including the explicit mention that the smelter avoids minerals which directly or indirectly finance or benefit illegal armed groups from conflict-affected regions. The policy must be publicly communicated, and it must be embedded into the smelter standard operating procedures, as well as internal training for employees that are charged with its implementation. The policy also needs to be shared with the smelter suppliers, and for those smelters that source from level 3 high-risk countries, it must conform with the Annex 2 of the OECD due diligence guidance. Annex 2 of the OECD due diligence guidance includes a model supply chain policy that covers a range of serious human rights abuses that the smelter is required to renounce. For tantalum smelters, the policy also must cover adherence to international transportation regulations for Class 7 material for tantalum ore and concentrates. For Class 7 material, the auditor is not required anymore to complete a full calculation of whether or not each transaction should have been classified as dangerous goods. However, the auditor is expected to look at the smelter system in place to evaluate whether or not a specific transaction is Class 7 material or not. To that effect, the auditor should select certain purchases for spot checking to make sure that the system as described by the smelter is actually applied to each of the transactions, that the system is effective and has indeed helped to determine whether those transactions were Class 7 material or not. In the event that the smelter receives Class 7 material, the auditors should also conduct spot checks to make sure that international transportation documentation is available in accordance with those international regulations. Again, this does not need to be done for all the purchases. A simple spot checking exercise will be sufficient to test the management systems in place. The second large area of compliance concerns the mass balance requirements. And the mass balance requirements are more than just the mass balance calculation. They include a review of the smelter's internal material control systems and physical inventory verification. The auditor is expected to review, again, the smelter's management systems in place to make sure that all inputs are recorded, all outputs are recorded, as well as inventory on site is properly managed and accounted for. In order to verify those systems, the auditor is expected to review the smelter's processes to allocate lot numbers for incoming material. This is very simple in that in the line item summary, each transaction has to have its own unique lot number. The auditor should also review the process to record weights and lot numbers for outgoing products and current inventory. This will be done during the revision of shipping records. Furthermore, the auditor should look at the smelter's processes to calculate inventory. The physical inventory verification, as mentioned earlier, is now not required anymore for all material on site. However, the auditor will still need to conduct a walkthrough of all relevant on- and off-site areas at the smelter. This walkthrough should be used to observe if the material that is found on site at the smelter is in conformance with what the smelter claims to receive and process. And it should also be an opportunity for the auditor to check the inventory control systems. As such, the auditor should request a current inventory list at the day of the audit and conduct a couple of spot checks. Usually a maximum of 5 spot checks should be enough unless there's any discrepancies identified, to verify that the inventory listed by the smelter can actually be identified on site. Primarily, however, again, this physical inventory verification is intended to test the smelter system and to make sure that the material observed on site corresponds to the material the smelter should normally be processing and has listed in the line item summary as being material that they receive. Lastly, for the mass balance requirements, the actual mass balance calculation needs to be completed using the template in the line item summary. The smelter will have to provide a material balance statement for the beginning and the end date of the audit period, a list of all the material received, which is the line item summary, work in progress, as well as estimated material losses if such calculations are available for the smelter in question. Material losses do not have to be provided to the auditor for the mass balance calculation if the smelter does not commonly estimate the losses throughout production. This will depend on the smelter's systems and processes in place. Based on this information, the smelter is encouraged to complete the mass balance calculation, which needs to be validated by the auditor during the on-site visit. Lastly, there is the ore and concentrate origin determination requirements. And before the auditor needs to look at any documents for origin and transportation, there is an entire process to select the relevant categories of material and purchases and make sure that the auditor and the smelter are fully clear on what needs to be validated. The first step in this process is the determination of applicability. In order to do so, the auditor will use the information provided in the line item summary, as well as the observations during the physical walkthrough to ensure that what has been listed on the line item summary seems reasonable. It is to be noted that during the physical walkthrough, most of the items from the line item summary may not be physically present anymore. There will be a time lapse between the end of the line item summary and the on-site visit of up to 30 days. Hence, in many cases, the material might already be processed by the smelter by the time the auditor arrives on site. Therefore, the observation of the physical inventory should provide a general overview of the types of material and cannot be taken as a cross-check of the information on the line item summary. Once the auditor has determined applicability of the different types of materials that have been listed and indicated by the smelter, the auditor will need to identify the samples for which he or she will want to review the entire documentation. A sampling approach may be used for level 1 purchases as well as secondary material. For level 1 purchases, the auditor will select 10% or a maximum of 25 transactions for review. Level 2 and level 3 non-secondary purchases must be reviewed 100%, so there is no sampling for those higher risk level countries. For secondary material, there is also a sampling plan which is included in both the audit protocol and the audit procedure. Auditors should communicate 50% of the identified samples for level 1 purchases and non-secondary receipts before the on-site visit. The remaining 50% of the samples shall be communicated to the smelter during the on-site visit, preferably during the opening meeting, so as to allow for sufficient time to prepare the documentation. Once the samples have been identified and communicated to the smelter will prepare all the documentation necessary for those transactions that need to be validated by the auditor, and the auditor will conduct the validation of the country of origin information as well as the transportation information. For level 3 purchases, the auditor will furthermore be required to validate due diligence measures that have been taken both by the smelter as well as the actors in the smelter's supply chain. As you will see throughout the presentation as well as in the revised audit tools, there is mention of so-called validation elements. The auditors will validate the origin and transportation of non-secondary material using different lists and tables in the audit protocol, which have also been annexed to the audit procedures for your convenience. In each of those tables, the CFS program has defined an audit goal or various audit goals and expectations, which are so-called validation elements throughout the different documents. For example, in this screenshot here, the validation element is the country of origin. For each validation element, the CFS has defined a number of key documents which should all be available for review for the auditor. Key documents that need to be provided for review to the auditor and which apply to, for example, level 1 countries would be marked in normal font. When moving to a higher risk country, such as a level 2 country, like in this example, additional requirements are indicated in bold. So again, looking at this example, the customs export record is something that must be provided for a level 1 country purchase. A government issued mine license is an additional requirement if the country of origin is a level 2 country. In addition, there have been lists of alternate documents provided for the auditor as well as for the smelter. Alternate documents only need to be provided for review by the smelter if key documents are not available. This means that if the auditor has seen all the key documents or sufficient key documents to validate the particular element, no alternate documents must be provided for review. So alternate documents are more intended to help both the smelter and the auditor in having alternatives and more options for documents that can be used to validate a specific element, and again in this example to validate a country of origin. A quick note on the sourcing from high-risk countries, which are the level 3 countries. In general, it should be noted that the CFS audits are not OECD due diligence guidance audits as described in Step 4. They do, however, cover quite a number of the components of the OECD due diligence guidance recommendations. As you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, the OECD due diligence guidance covers those 5 steps of having strong management systems, conducting a risk assessment, identifying risk mitigation measures, undergoing an independent third-party audit, and reporting on the due diligence carried out on the supply chain. Now again, although some of these elements may not be covered by the CFS audit, many of the recommendations are. So there is this focus on evaluating management systems, and smelters are required to look at risks in their supply chains. As such, when smelters are sourcing from level 3 countries, the auditors must validate 3 elements of management systems. First of all, the smelter must have a system to collect information for all validation elements of the level 3 country requirements. Secondly, the smelter must have systems in place to review the collected information on a regular basis. And thirdly, the smelter must have a system in place to follow up on any issues discovered in this review. So this means that the auditors are not expected to look at each individual document from an in-region sourcing scheme. However, you still have to validate all the transactions from a level 3 country with a view to, in turn, validate the management systems in place at the smelter. And again, the smelter must have those 3 elements in place to systematically collect all the information necessary, to review that information, and to follow up on any issues that are discovered during this review. There are what is called credible OECD conformant in-region sourcing schemes, which have been pre-evaluated by the CFS program. Currently, this only covers the ITSCI program. However, there might be others going forward, and if you have any doubts as to whether a specific sourcing scheme from a level 3 country can be accepted as pre-evaluated by the CFS, please contact the CFS program manager. For any such credible in-region sourcing scheme, the auditors don't need to validate the information in the documents that have been generated by such a mechanism. For example, if there is an ITSCI audit report on a supplier in the smelter's supply chain, the auditors do not have to look at this audit report and evaluate whether or not the audit report is credible and whether the methodology was done in accordance with the requirements of the CFS, etc. You can accept this audit report as is because the ITSCI scheme has been pre-evaluated by the CFS. In turn, the focus of the CFS auditor will be to make sure that all the supplier audit reports have been collected for all the suppliers in level 3 countries that were used by the smelter, that the smelter has read those reports and has understood them, and that the smelter has reacted or has systems in place to react to any issues that were highlighted in such audit reports that were provided by the mechanism. Also, to accommodate the different levels at which documentation is situated, the line item summary has now split the requirements for level 3 into different sections. There are validation elements which are applicable to each individual transaction. These include, for example, tracking devices or shipment reports that correlate tracking devices to particular mine sites. These are specific to each shipment or each transaction of material that originated in a level 3 country. Such validation elements are included as they used to be in the line item summary in the usual format that the auditors have so far been using. However, there are also validation elements which are applicable, more broadly speaking, to either a supplier in the level 3 supply chain, to the smelter itself, or to a province or a country of origin. Now, these validation elements have been covered in a separate tab in the line item summary, which looks at management systems evaluations. The auditor must ensure that both sections are complete, both the management systems tab as well as the individual transactions tab. In addition, for the management systems question, it is the auditor's responsibility to ensure that they validate the information for all the suppliers that are used for all the countries and provinces that were found in the smelter supply chain, and so for any entity really that has been found in the supply chain. So basically, just because it's not listed by transaction anymore doesn't mean that auditors only need to look at one supplier in the supply chain. You still need to cover 100% of those actors. To shed a little bit more light on how this should all be presented, let's have a quick look at the revised audit tools. There are currently 3 audit tools at the disposal of the auditors. The first one is the Pre-Audit Checklist, which should primarily be used to determine the audit scope, and as such is a tool intended for audit program managers. There is the second tool of the combined line item summary and pre-audit checklist, which is the key document auditors should be using when they're on site and conducting the assessment. And there is an audit summary report to ensure that results of the audit are communicated consistently and in a uniform format to the Audit Review Committee of the CFS program. Coming back to the pre-audit checklist, this one has been very much reduced compared to the previous document. It only includes the smelter's physical location, the number of transactions for each type of material received, and a very short readiness assessment. The readiness assessment is primarily aimed to ensure that all the necessary paperwork and agreements have been signed, that the line item summary is completed, and basically that the smelter is ready to receive the auditor. Smelters with multiple locations should complete one tab for each location, so there is multiple checklists included in the overall Excel sheet. The pre-audit checklist does not describe the smelter's processes anymore. There's a different document in use for that. And it also does not help smelters in the audit preparation. For that purpose, the line item summary has been expanded and includes much more detailed information than it previously did. The audit checklist and line item summary, as mentioned before, is a combined document that serves 3 different purposes. It is aimed to provide guidance for smelters to prepare for the audit, so it includes instructions for smelters and color-coded information that needs to be completed by smelters ahead of time. It is a working tool for the auditors during their on-site visit, and it is a reporting template including the detailed information from the audit that can be used to go back to the CFS as well as the Audit Review Committee. The document is based in Excel format and organized in 5 tabs. There is an instructions tab that does not contain any cells which need to be completed. It then has a management systems and a mass balance tab. And those 2 tabs are the previous audit checklist in a very summarized and very much concise form. So the previous audit checklist can now fit on more or less 3 pages if they're printed out. And it is really just a very short assessment of management systems for those 3 big compliance areas, the policy, the mass balance, as well as the due diligence mechanisms for level 3 countries, and includes a mass balance template that the auditor has to submit to the CFS. Tab number 3 and 4 of the line item summary are the non-secondary material receipts and the secondary receipts. So that's the information which was already previously included in the line item summary. Please note that the tabs for inventory for both non-secondary and secondary inventory have been removed simply because there will be too much of a gap between the end of the line item summary and the on-site visit for inventory to really be necessary. The first tab of the line item summary includes those instructions as mentioned, so that's really the part which should guide both smelters and auditors on how to complete each of the tabs for this tool. Instructions are color-coded, and so is the remainder of the line item summary tool. So anything that is highlighted in blue in the instructions as well as throughout the document must be completed by the auditee, so by the smelter, before the on-site visit. Anything which is highlighted in green throughout the document must be completed by the auditor. Some of it must be completed before the on-site visit, but most of it must be completed during the on-site visit. In the tabs 3 and 4 on the non-secondary and secondary receipts, there is a compliance summary at the very end of the list. So the only thing that auditors are expected to complete during the on-site visit is that short compliance summary, which includes 2 or 3 questions for each transaction. In order to get it, you will have to scroll all the way to the right, which can be quite long for the non-secondary receipts. So please make sure not to overlook this last part of the line item summary and complete this for every transaction that has been reviewed. Also, a quick note, those alternate documents, which are not mandatory to have, but only need to be provided if key documents are missing. These are highlighted in gray in the line item summary to make it more clear that they are just secondary documentation and do not need to be requested on a systematic basis. Please also note that the line item summary has a function to group and hide columns for each section, which means that for each category of material, such as legacy materials or level 1 material, level 2 material, level 3 material, each of those sections can be hidden. If you go all the way up in the Excel sheet, you will find a little plus or a little minus, and by clicking on that plus or that minus, the respective section can be minimized and hidden, or it can be expanded. This should help auditors and smelters in navigating through the document and reducing the length of the line item summary. The third tab in the line item summary, the second tab in the line item summary concerns the management systems. And as mentioned before, it includes those 3 sections. There are questions on the conflict minerals policy, which basically repeat the various points that we earlier discussed on what the policy needs to include and whether it has been appropriately communicated and people have been trained on its content and implementation. There is a section on mass balance compliance requirements, which is primarily intended to review the processes that the smelter has in place for the recording of inputs, recording of outputs, and the management of the current inventory. Now, the mass balance compliance section in the Management Systems tab also includes some questions on the physical inventory check, those spot checks that we have covered in an earlier slide, as well as the review of shipping records. Now, as mentioned, the shipping record review, or previously the sales receipts review, has also been reduced. Sales receipts or shipping records only need to be reviewed for 1 month. So the auditor will only need to sum up all the individual shipping records and compare the overall volume of those individual receipts to the overall sales volume for that month, for 1 month in question, and only if the smelter uses a manual system to record shipping. If the smelter uses an electronic system to record their shipments, such as SAP, for example, the auditor only needs to conduct a couple of spot checks to make sure that the system is working properly. But you do not need to review an entire month anymore. Only if there are discrepancies observed should the auditor widen that sample and include another 1 or up to 2 months to review more shipping records. The third section in the Management Systems tab is this guidance or questionnaire on the level 3 sourcing, which covers all those validation elements that are not specific to a transaction. Again, the auditor must ensure that these elements are covered for all level 3 transactions. However, please also note that this section only needs to be completed if the smelter sources from a level 3 country. This is what the Management Systems tab looks like. As you can see at the very top, the section 2 on audit period and material covered is highlighted in blue, so this section needs to be completed by the smelter. And the remaining questions, in this case the section on the conflict minerals compliance, are highlighted in green, so they need to be completed by the auditor during the on-site visit. Please note that the sheet is not protected, so you will be able to add or edit as needed, as long as you do not remove the questions that are included on the sheet. They should all be answered throughout the process. The next tab of the line item summary includes the mass balance calculation. Now, it also includes a legend on the different types of materials that need to be included for each section. And it should be noted that the smelter and/or the auditor may add additional sections depending on the smelter's operation. So, for example, for material received, there is a certain number of descriptions of what type of material was received, so purchases or tolling or any other category of material receipt. If the smelter has other categories, such as customer returns or any other types of receipts that they may have, you feel free to add those sections to the mass balance calculation. However, auditors and smelters should not change the calculation as it is now in this template. The auditor must submit this template to the CFS program to ensure that everybody uses the same calculation. While smelters may use different mass balance calculations for their operations, they must work together with the auditor to transfer their own calculation into this template, again to make sure that the CFS program is able to compare the different calculations by using the same methodology for each. The template for the mass balance calculation is already completed with the formulas necessary, so you would just need to enter the weights of the different materials in each section, and you should get at the very end of the template the error margin calculated automatically. With that, we are moving to the non-secondary and secondary receipts review. For this process, there is quite a bit of work that needs to be done prior to the on-site visit of the auditor. First of all, the smelter will complete a basic section of the line item summary, which is called Identification of Material by Transaction. It is, as you can see in the example below, highlighted in blue, indicating that it is the smelter's responsibility to complete the information. This section contains primarily information on the type of material, the category, so whether it is level 1, a level 2 purchase, a legacy material, something from a supplying smelter, etc. It includes the weight, the date received, the lot number of the material. This needs to be completed for all material received by the smelter throughout the audit period. The partially completed line item summary is then submitted to the CFS program manager. The CFS program manager will forward this to the auditor once the auditor has been selected, and the auditor will then select all the transactions that he or she will want to validate during the on-site visit by marking X in the column that has been designed for this purpose. This means the auditor should select a sample for level 1 and secondary material, and must also select all the level 2 and level 3 purchases that were placed by the smelter during the audit period. For the level 1 samples and the secondary material, the auditor should only mark 50% of the samples that they will want to review prior to sending the line item summary back to the smelter. The remaining 50% will be communicated at a later point in time. Once the auditor has selected all the transactions to be validated, the line item summary is returned to the smelter, and the smelter completes the line item summary depending on the category or type of material. Again, for example, if their material is from a level 2 country and the origin determination is applicable, the smelter will need to complete all the sections in the line item summary for level 1, level 2 countries with all the necessary information and the documents that will be available for review to the auditor. The auditor will then validate the information that has been completed by the smelter during the on-site visit. In addition, as mentioned earlier, the auditor will also communicate the remaining 50% of the samples identified for level 1 purchases and for secondary material, and will complete at the very end of the line item summary the transaction compliance summary. So again, the first 3 steps of this process take place before the auditor gets on site, so there is quite a bit of a scheduling required to make sure that the line item summary is submitted in time within a 30 days time frame of the end of the receipts that are listed in the line item summary, and with sufficient time for the auditor to select that sample and send the line item summary back, and for the smelter to prepare all the information. So in essence, the partially completed line item summary should reach the CFS program manager at least 14 days prior to the on-site visit. On this slide, you see an example of what the line item summary now looks like for non-secondary and secondary transactions. As you will note very quickly, the layout is still quite similar. However, there have been a few changes here and there to streamline the information. The very top row will include the section title. In this case, it was level 1 requirements. And as you can see, all the first 3 rows are highlighted in blue, indicating again that this information needs to be completed by the smelter and validated by the auditor. The second row right here describes the type of material sources. Now, as we have seen earlier on, there are reduced expectations for artisanal and small-scale mining sources. Therefore, there are different sections in the line item summary for large-scale mining and artisanal and small-scale mining sources. The validation element is noted in the next row. So this one here would be the country of origin validation. There are some questions in the line item summary, although there's very few of them, which are primarily concerned with data gathering, such as the country of origin of the material will ask the smelter to list the country name for each transaction. This is not a compliance question, but it's simply there to gather information and also to make sure that the auditor is situated in the right, or the smelter first, and then the auditor is situated in the right category when completing the line item summary. Validation statements have been added, such as country of origin validated or international transportation validated. What this means is that once the smelter has reviewed the documentation that they have and has completed the different lines on the validating documentation, they should be able to say, yes, we have validated the country of origin, or no, we have not validated the country of origin. So this is a summary statement for each validation element to determine whether or not sufficient documentation has been provided to validate that element. And in order to get to this conclusion of yes or no, it has been validated, the smelter needs to complete the different validating documents columns. For example, here, for the country of origin, the smelter should have a customs export record. For the other national transportation, there are several validating documents which the smelter is supposed to complete. If the validating document, for example, the customs export record, is not available, only then should the smelter or the auditor move to the alternate document. There is no specific list of alternate documents included in the line item summary. However, reference is made to the respective table in the audit protocol for smelters and auditors to go back and double check whether the document is acceptable to validate the particular element that they are trying to validate. As you can see here, these cells are shaded in gray, which is again to emphasize that these are not mandatory documents and only need to be requested if the validating documents are not available for review. The row below this information indicates the level of review, which means that for most of this information, the level is specific to an individual transaction. However, for level 3 purchases, there are some documents which are specific to mine sites, and so they might be the same for different transactions, or there might be multiple mine sites for material in the same shipment. In order to facilitate the understanding for the smelter and the auditor what level they are reviewing, the information has been included for each type of document. So in this example, all the information would be specific to an individual transaction. Lastly, the last row contains the information that needs to be entered by the smelter. It describes what should be entered in the cells below. So in the case of this inland forwarding note, the smelter should indicate what type of document it is that they have available, as well as a unique reference number for that document. With that, we are moving to the audit summary report. Now, the audit summary report has been aligned with ISO 19011 reporting requirements. This means that there are a number of sections included which will be repeated for each audit, such as the audit methodology, the audit criteria, which have been added primarily to ensure alignment with ISO standards, and hence they have not been included in previous reports, or not necessary. There is a standardized audit conclusion and audit summary page at the very beginning of the report. You can see it on the right side of the slide. The audit conclusion has been standardized to facilitate the review by the Audit Review Committee and provide a very high-level overview over the audit result. As you can see on the right-hand side, there is only two possible outcomes for each CFS audit. A smelter can either be compliant or non-compliant with the audit protocol's requirements. There is no gradual assessment of compliance possible. If the auditor found a smelter to be non-compliant, then he or she is asked to indicate which sections of the audit protocol the non-conformance relates to. There are only these three major sections, the conflict minerals policy, the mass balance, and the material type and origin verification. Now, of course, the smelter may have non-conformances in each of those areas, or in only one of them, or in two of them, and so the auditor will need to tick the appropriate boxes. Lastly, the auditor is expected to make a statement as to whether the smelter has agreed to address the non-conformances with the appropriate action to go with that, or whether the smelter has not agreed to address the non-conformances identified. In addition, the summary report includes a table to list the different non-conformances, which includes an opportunity for the smelter's management to make a statement or comment on the non-conformance that the auditor has presented to them. Management does not have to make a statement. However, they are given the opportunity to do so should they wish to add something. There is also a space for auditors to include observations or recommendations for improvement. If there are any observations made that do not constitute non-compliances, and yet where the auditor feels that the smelter could improve practices, such recommendations may be included in the report as well. Lastly, the summary report includes more detailed instructions and guidance for each section of the report on the type of information to be included. Primarily, the information will be summaries from the more detailed assessment in the audit checklist and line item summary. However, we encourage auditors to look at the report prior to the on-site visit to make sure that you are fully aware of the reporting requirements. Auditors are free to find more information online. There is quite a number of sources available in the space of conflict-free sourcing. And 4 of the key websites have been included in this slide for your information. The International Tin Research Institute provides a lot of background information on tin. The Tantalum Niobium International Study Center includes a lot of useful information and pictures on tantalum for those auditors that are not yet familiar with either mineral. The OECD has very extensive information available publicly on the OECD due diligence guidance and its implementation. And lastly, there is a website for the ITSC bag and tag in-region sourcing scheme from level 3 countries, primarily DRC and Rwanda at the moment, that auditors can look at in order to get more information on how the mechanism works. In addition, if you have any questions in regards to the revised audit protocol and procedures and or the audit tools for TIN and Tantalum, please contact and myself at the email address listed here. With that, I thank you very much for your attention, and we look forward to working with you.